waiting for butterfly.
Good afternoon, flappers and philosophers. I hope you all enjoyed the smooth sounds of questionably downloaded jazz. What can I say? Prohibition has us all feeling a little extra rebellious these days. My name is Hope Tucker, and today I'll be reading Butterflyin and Signifyin, Call and Response in Fitzgerald's Use of Jazz. Please, no flash photography, and save all questions for the end of the presentation. Although they were not seriously regarded by academia until decades after their author's death, the works of F. Scott Fitzgerald are now subject to a variety of critical review. Now a century after his first publication, F. Scott Fitzgerald remains famous for creating stories and characters that are multi-layered mosaics of psychological study, popular culture, and real-life people and places. This connection to the real world extends beyond the surface level, as it has been noted by several scholars that Fitzgerald's works contain an unusual number of popular song titles and lyrics. In digging deeper, one finds that song references populate even his unpublished works, manuscripts, letters, essays, and biographical material. All of these come together to highlight the importance of Fitzgerald's most frequently cited music genre, jazz. In my research paper, I highlight a threefold interpretation of jazz's most prominent feature, call and response, Fitzgerald as the responder to generational post-war trauma, Fitzgerald as the caller seeking response in the public discourse, and most significantly, Fitzgerald as both the caller and the responder in the interconnectedness of his works. By examining jazz music from its influence on Fitzgerald to its African-American roots, especially through the lens of a cultural call and response notion known as Signifyin, I want to trace Fitzgerald's music references as intertextual responses to his earlier texts. I will focus today mainly on his repeated use of the 1916 Broadway hit, Poor Butterfly, cited in his autobiographical novels, This Side of Paradise in 1920, The Beautiful and Damned in 1922, and Tender as the Night in 1934. This will support my argument that, from the retrospective position of 1934 in Tender, Fitzgerald is both the caller and the responder, responding to the call of embarrassing past versions of himself, a kind of calling out, if you will, of Fitzgerald the party boy, the heavy drinker, the adulterer, and tracing his own journey from being childishly unreflective to slightly aware to critical of self and country. Although Fitzgerald's music references have received some scholarly attention, there is no in-depth study that makes connections with the man behind the music. Ruth Bragosi points out the potential for further studies with a landmark 1977 article that highlights Fitzgerald's musical intentionality by making reference to the, quote, 71 song titles and innumerable lyrics, end quote, in his canon. Other critics follow suit, pointing to song popularity as the main factor in Fitzgerald's choices and exploring the function of his music as a literary soundtrack. The critic whose work comes closest to attributing a thematic significance is Mitchell Breitweiser, whose 2000 article, Jazz Fractures, F. Scott Fitzgerald and Epochal Representation, delves into the implications of the term jazz age as, quote, an intense, ungraspable cultural energy, end quote. Although a few critics have sought to expand the study of Fitzgerald's song references, it was not until 2013 that Anthony Barrett published a full-length analysis of every song reference and lyric in every Fitzgerald work in his book, Music in the Works of F. Scott Fitzgerald. Because the scope of this project means that Barrett cannot possibly analyze every reference in detail, certain sections of the book receive less attention than others, and the section on Tender is one of them. Fitzgerald's major genre choice gains another layer of meaning when one takes into account how jazz music's call and response mechanism translates to literature. African-American theorist and literary critic Henry Louis Gates Jr. addresses call and response and its effect on not just African-American works, but literature as a whole, in his 1988 book, The Signifyin Monkey. Gates introduces the African-American cultural concept of signifying, which he defines as, quote, the connotative, context-bound significance of words, which is accessible only to those who share the cultural values of a given speech community." End quote. The term signifyin, Gates explains, applies not just to the call and response pattern of speech, but to African American music styles as well, and perhaps none more than jazz. In her 1999 book, Signifyin, Sanctifyin, and Slam Dunkin', Gina Daigle Capone gives examples of signifyin in music as, quote, calls, cries, hollers, riffs, licks, overlapping antiphony, end quote, and says that musical expression is a way to extend beyond the repetition of chords and melodies to add meaning to both the song and the situation it represents. She states, quote, signifyin is also a way of demonstrating respect for, goading, or poking fun at a musical style, process, or practice. Signifyin shows, among other things, either reverence or irreverence toward previously stated musical statements and values, end quote. In responding musically to both the events of his own stories and those in the world around him, both reverently and irreverently, I might add, Fitzgerald is signifying with his contemporaries and that they understand their shared bedrock values and experiences in a way that no one outside of their time or culture could. If Fitzgerald's jazz is a form of signifying that follows a call and response mechanism, I identify 3 different things he may be calling or responding to. Aside from the already mentioned idea that World War I is the call and Fitzgerald the responder, there is also the implication that Fitzgerald himself, through his works and the performative nature of his life, is extending a call to his audience and seeking a response in the public discourse. However, as an expanded definition of signifying found in the Encyclopedia Britannica states, quote, the pervasiveness and centrality of signifying in African and African American literature and music means that all such expression is essentially a dialogue with the music and literature of the past, end quote. Fitzgerald works in continual dialogue with the music and written words that pervade a popular culture in which the past pervades the present. Hence, the full extent of the term signifying suggests a third way to understand Fitzgerald's use of call and response, most fully realized in his last completed novel, that Fitzgerald is not just reacting to the war or calling to the masses, but is continually responding to wayward earlier versions of himself. The 1916 hit song, Poor Butterfly, itself a response to Giacomo Puccini's 1904 opera, Madame Butterfly, appears in 3 of Fitzgerald's major autobiographical novels. This Side of Paradise in 1920, The Beautiful and Damned in 1922, and Tender as the Night in 1934. This Broadway hit, written by composer Raymond Hubble and lyricist John Golden, tells the story of a young Japanese woman waiting for an American lover who will never return to her. Over the course of these 3 novels, Poor Butterfly takes on 3 very different meanings that mature over time. Specifically, I'm interpreting the Poor Butterfly references in these 3 separate works as intertextually connected responses to Fitzgerald's evolving view of self and country. The allusion to Poor Butterfly in Fitzgerald's first novel, This Side of Paradise, presents the 20-year-old Fitzgerald as childishly unreflective about the consequences of World War on both himself and his country. At this moment in the novel, main character Amory Blaine, a mirror image of the college Fitzgerald, is failing all of his classes and sort of coasting along through life at Princeton University. The song's primary function in the text is to create a transition period while still establishing time and place. As the month of April 1917 is described as, quote, a haze of long evenings on the club veranda with the graphophone playing Poor Butterfly inside. For Poor Butterfly had been the song of that last year, end quote. On the surface, it seems that Fitzgerald is using Poor Butterfly to move past a hazy, less than exciting time in Amory's life, using pop culture as a kind of literary montage. However, the description of this month in Fitzgerald's own life, as related in Matthew Bruckley's acclaimed 1981 Fitzgerald biography, Some Sort of Epic Grandeur, sheds light on the full significance of the time. As Bruckley states, quote, on 6 April 1917, America entered the war, rather to Fitzgerald's relief, for it solved the problem of his future. He did not volunteer immediately. Instead, he signed up in May for 3 weeks of intensive military training under a plan by which students were given full credit for their dropped academic courses, end quote. Much like the slow, smooth jazz selection functions as ambient background noise for Amory's long, lazy evenings avoiding his homework on the veranda, It seems that while the idea of war remained in the back of Fitzgerald's mind in the month between America's joining the war and his enlisting, he was motivated by his laziness in college to enlist without reflecting on the reality of a war that eventually claimed 40 million lives worldwide. While Amory's unreflective nature points to Fitzgerald's childish self-pride in 1917, it also relates to his relationship with America. Instead of joining the Army in an act of sacrificial patriotism, both Amory and Fitzgerald join in a selfish effort to avoid personal consequences. This second instance of Poor Butterfly in Fitzgerald's novels occurs in The Beautiful and Damned, which marks Fitzgerald's transition from being childishly unreflective about major life choices to growing in self-awareness while still maintaining a sense of obliviousness to those around him. The Beautiful and Damned tells the story of New York socialite Anthony Patch's rocky marriage with Gloria Gilbert and is considered a loosely autobiographical portrayal of Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda's struggle to balance their relationship with their desire for wealth and status. In the novel, Poor Butterfly takes on a new meaning as the song plays on a phonograph in the background when Anthony's drunken friends awaken Japanese butler Tana, place him on top of a table, and make him play a traditional railroad song on his flute. Anthony Barrett says that this juxtaposition not only highlights a clash of cultures, but also criticizes American culture, as the men's treatment of Tana mirrors the American soldier who, in the original Madame Butterfly, betrays his former lover by returning to Japan with his American wife. Barrett's interpretation does not, however, account for the reaction of Anthony, who, like Amory in This Side of Paradise, is Fitzgerald's primary means of expressing his own personal beliefs in the text. Not only is Anthony complicit in making a spectacle of Tana, as he and his wife Gloria join in the moving of tables, piling of chairs, rolling of carpets, and breaking of lamps, in creating a makeshift stage for the butler. But Anthony then focuses only on speaking with Gloria's friend Rachel, without attracting Gloria's attention once the music begins. Barrett's interpretation, along with the novel's major theme of Anthony awakening to his own selfishness as his marriage dissolves, speaks to the beginnings of Fitzgerald's self-awareness, but Anthony's reaction, or lack thereof, to Poor Butterfly and Tana's humiliation indicates that Fitzgerald is still largely unaware of his insensitivity as well as that of his fellow Americans. The last example of Poor Butterfly, which can be found in Fitzgerald's last completed novel, Tender as the Night, represents Fitzgerald as retrospectively critical of self and country. But loosely based on Fitzgerald's years as an expatriate on the French Riviera, as well as his wife Zelda's 1930 schizophrenia diagnosis and hospitalization, Tender tells the rise and fall of American expatriate and psychologist Dick Diver. In the novel, Dick falls in love with and eventually marries Nicole Warren, who is left mentally ill after being raped by her father as a young teen. The song Poor Butterfly weaves itself into the text in two different ways. The first way is not through the mention of the song itself, but rather through the unwritten lyrics of Goodbye Alexander, one of the song titles mentioned in a conversation between Dick and Nicole the night they meet. Goodbye Alexander tells the story of an African-American woman watching her boyfriend, Alexander Cooper, go off to fight in World War I, and includes the following lyrics. Alexander, I'll save my lovin' for you. I'll be waiting like Poor Butterfly. The reference to this song on the first night Dick and Nicole meet foreshadows the fact that, while their love is genuine at first, Dick will eventually be absent from Nicole's life. By infusing Poor Butterfly, itself a form of Signifyin, as a smooth jazz remix of a popular opera, into a song that depicts African-American characters responding to World War I, songwriters Henry Kramer and Turner Layton are further signifying on the theme of the original Madame Butterfly, as well as the 1916 Broadway hit song, in a way that further aligns the story with a specific cultural entity. Fitzgerald's choice to use this song shows that, although undoubtedly unfamiliar with the term Signifyin, he not only appreciates the way that concepts evolve and expand over time as people respond to them, but also seeks to approach ideas and concepts from multiple angles in his own mind. The second instance of Poor Butterfly occurs when Baby Warren, unaware that her father molested her younger sister, says of Nicole's mental illness, quote, Nicole had some shock. In my opinion, it was about a boy, but we don't really know. Father says he would have shot him if he could have found out, end quote. Right as she says this, Dick notices an orchestra playing the song in the background and thinks of the dishonor, the secret, of Nicole being raped by her father. Although this last instance is an orchestral version, Fitzgerald includes lyrics from the song, "The moments pass into hours," not in quotation marks, as he typically does with song lyrics in his texts, but in the voice of the narrator. In the sense of Tinder's plot, this can rightly be viewed as a way of further ingraining the song and its association with betrayal into the reader's consciousness. However, in looking at the Signifyin roots below the surface, one can read it as a kind of final embodiment of the song that Fitzgerald has written of so much that it has become a part of his own subconscious identity. The use of "Poor Butterfly" to describe Nicole's relationship with her father is particularly effective, even though the situation entails a father-daughter relationship instead of a typical romantic one, because, as Nicole's father Devereux Warren explains upon his confession, "We were just like lovers, and then all at once we were lovers." Nicole, like the woman in Poor Butterfly, seems also to have experienced some separation anxiety, as evidenced by the fact that she writes to Dick before they have met in person, "So today I have written my father to come and take me away." Throughout the rest of the book, it appears as if, like the American soldier in Poor Butterfly, Devereux Warren never again returns to Nicole. And, as foreshadowed in the earlier example of Goodbye Alexander, Dick, desperate to blame his wife's mental state entirely on her father's actions, rather than take any responsibility for himself, follows suit. The actor placing the American soldier, the failing husband, and the molester of his own daughter in the same role through this song indicates that the criticism of both Fitzgerald himself and American culture that surfaces in using Poor Butterfly in The Beautiful and Damned is even more pronounced in Tinder. Fitzgerald's twin evolution of his views of self and country point to the fact that he sees himself and America as being interconnected. At the prime of his success, Fitzgerald shaped American popular culture, coining the term Jazz Age, and even expressing to one of his editors that he viewed himself as an oracle to an entire generation of, quote, "countless flappers and college kids," end quote. But much like Dick Diver in Tinder, Fitzgerald's life choices ultimately resulted in his downfall. Although unfamiliar with the chord structures and conventions of jazz, Fitzgerald latched onto the style as a vehicle of expressing not just the psychological condition of his era as a whole, but the individual man responding to the call of his former selves and reflecting on what is now and what could have been, and signifying on himself by looking back at this side of paradise and The Beautiful and Damned. Fitzgerald ultimately acts through Tinder as an oracle. However, instead of doing so as a cultural icon of success like he previously had in mind, he points to self-indulgence, alcoholism, and destructive relationships in prophesying his own demise.
Poor butterfly needs the blossoms when